What if one small act of kindness, not flashy, not famous, not filmed for applause, could ripple through an entire town and rewrite decades of prejudice, pain, and silence? This isn't a story about charity. It's a story about a forgotten shelter, a black woman who refused to stop fighting, and a tattooed stranger on a motorcycle whose gas tank ran dry in the wrong town at the right time. It began with ridicule. It ended with redemption. And somewhere in between, it reminded us all what happens when compassion dares to speak louder than fear. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever wondered whether a single moment can change everything, stay with us. Because this story will show you not only that it can, but that it already did. There are places in this world where time seems to stand still, not in a charming, postcard sort of way, but in a heavy, unmoving silence, like a town that held its breath and forgot how to exhale. Ashford Hollow was one of those places. You wouldn't find it on a travel blog or in a glossy magazine spread. It was wedged somewhere between the state border and the past, a place where rust painted the story on gas pumps older than your grandparents and wind whispered secrets down. Roads too cracked for repair. And in that forgotten corner of the world lived a woman named Jasmine Cole. If you walked past her too quickly, you might not notice her. But if you stopped, even for a second, and looked past the tired jeans and weather-beaten sneakers, you'd see her strength was stitched into every breath she took. This wasn't strength born of adrenaline or applause. It was the quiet kind, the kind that came from holding things together long after they should have fallen apart. Jasmine was 28, black, orphaned by 8, raised by her grandmother in a town that never clapped when she survived another day. And that was the norm in Ashford Hollow. People didn't talk, they whispered. They didn't welcome, they stared. And they certainly didn't forgive people for standing out, especially if that person was trying to do something good. Jasmine ran the Harbor Light Home, a shelter for disabled and abandoned children that sat like a forgotten sigh on the edge of town, nestled up against the woods. The paint had long given up, peeling like sunburn. The roof leaked if you even thought about rain, and donations came as often as miracles. But Jasmine showed up every day, because someone had to. And if not her, then who? That morning, like many others, she walked the dusty streets of Ashford Hollow with a handful of wrinkled flyers. Each one pleated in faded ink, "Harbor Light Home, help us help them." She passed shuttered diners, empty windows, and people who never quite met her gaze. Most pretended not to see her. A few didn't bother pretending. A man muttered about people begging for handouts. A woman clutched her purse like kindness was contagious. A teenage boy laughed and said, "No one wants her or that broken shack she's fighting for." Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't respond, because this wasn't new. And it wasn't personal, it was systemic. Ashford Hollow didn't need a reason to hate. It only needed a target. Still, Jasmine kept walking. Each step carried the weight of kids who couldn't speak for themselves. Each breath was a small protest against the silence that swallowed people whole. And it's important we talk about people like Jasmine, not because they're saints, but because they remind us how easy it is to be invisible in plain sight. It wasn't even the hate that hurt most days, it was the apathy, the hollow glances, the way the town collectively agreed not to care. You see, in places like Ashford Hollow, The rules are unwritten but universally understood. Stay in your lane, keep your head down, and don't stir the water. Jasmine broke all 3 rules just by existing. And what none of them knew, what Jasmine herself couldn't have imagined, was that the universe was about to stir the water for her. A small moment, a simple act, one gas station, one stranger, and everything would change. But before we get to that, let's pause. Because too often we race to the redemption and forget the resilience that got someone to the edge. Jasmine had spent her life carrying burdens no one offered to help lift. But she still believed people could care. That belief? It hadn't been crushed. It had just been bruised. And it was that sliver of hope, thin and trembling, that made what happened next so powerful. Ashford Hollow wasn't the kind of place where surprises happened unless they were bad. Flat tires, overdoses, foreclosure notices, those were the town's daily headlines. So when a rumble echoed down the cracked road leading to the outskirts, nobody paid much attention. It wasn't uncommon for bikers to pass through. They didn't stop. They didn't stay. Ashford Hollow had a way of pushing outsiders back where they came from. But this morning was different. As Jasmine pulled her dented old sedan into the edge stall of the only working gas station left in town, she noticed something off. A crowd was forming, not with urgency, but with that sickly excitement small towns get when there's something to gawk at. At the center of it stood a man next to a gleaming motorcycle. He looked like the kind of guy movies warned you about: leather jacket faded with time, arms sleeved in ink, eyes like sharpened steel. The kind of man who didn't care about fitting in because the world never gave him a good reason to try. The name embroidered across his jacket read Lawson. Rhett Lawson. And he was in trouble. The station attendant, a squat man with a permanent scowl, had his finger jabbing the air. No cash, no gas. Simple as that. Rhett's voice was calm, but Jasmine could hear the fatigue in it. "I'm not trying to skip out. I thought you took mobile pay. I've been on the road for 2 days. I'm trying to get home to my mother. She's sick." But facts meant nothing here. Not when the man saying them had tattoos, a bike, and a patch on his jacket that read Road Saints MC, a name the town assumed meant danger. "He's lying," someone muttered. "Bet he's high." "Call the sheriff," another whispered, already pulling out a phone not to help but to film. Jasmine watched it unfold from the pump across the lot, and she recognized that moment, that slow sinking swirl when a group decides you're guilty before you've spoken a word. It didn't matter that Rhett was composed, or that he never raised his voice. He had the wrong look, the wrong story, the wrong patch, and that was enough. And here's where Jasmine faced a choice. She could do what was expected, look away, mind her business, let the town eat itself alive on another lie. But Jasmine had seen too many scenes like this. Some she'd lived through herself. Others she watched helplessly from a distance. So this time she stepped forward. "I'll pay for his gas." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It slid into the space like a knife into soft wood, quiet but impossible to ignore. The crowd froze. The clerk blinked. Rhett turned, his expression unreadable but undeniably surprised. "You serious?" the attendant scoffed. "You don't even know this guy." Jasmine's jaw tightened. "No, I don't, but I know what it looks like when someone's being cornered for no reason." Laughter rippled through the crowd, sharp and mocking. "Guess trouble attracts trouble," someone sneered. Jasmine ignored it. She walked into the store and handed over her last bills. Money meant for flyers or groceries, or maybe even just one peaceful afternoon. Gone. But she didn't blink, didn't flinch. She simply paid. Not because she expected something in return, but because she understood. Sometimes compassion is the only rebellion you can afford. The clerk grumbled, but took the cash. Rhett didn't speak until she handed him the receipt. "You didn't have to do that," he said, voice low, gravelly. "I know," Jasmine replied. A gust of wind caught one of her flyers, lifting it from the car door and flinging it to his feet. He picked it up. "Read it. Harbor Light Home for Children. We need your help." He looked up, but Jasmine was already walking away. She didn't need thanks. She didn't expect miracles. She just hoped the world would tilt slightly more human for 1 minute. That would be enough. Or so she thought. 3 days passed, not long by most measures. But in a town like Ashford Hollow, where change was a fossil and grudges grew like ivy on cracked brick, 3 days might as well be forever. Jasmine had returned to her usual rhythm, though rhythm might be too graceful a word for it. It was more like survival on repeat. Each morning she handed out flyers. Each afternoon she organized what little food the shelter had left. And each night she counted more unpaid bills than hours of sleep. Harbor Light Home was still standing, but just barely. The roof still dripped when the weather got moody. The pantry shelves echoed like hollowness had moved in. Donations were a memory, volunteers a fantasy, and the town? Still deaf, still watching her struggle like it was sport. But Jasmine didn't quit. She couldn't, because somewhere in the echoes of that shelter were the laughter of children, kids the world had tried to forget, kids who smiled because she did. Then came the sound, distant, deep, rumbling like thunder with purpose. It wasn't a storm. It was something else entirely. Jasmine stood on the weather-worn porch steps, peeling paint beneath her palms, when she heard it. Engines, more than one. Growing louder, tires crunching gravel, and then dust. A cloud rose at the edge of the drive. Jasmine stepped forward, her body frozen somewhere between dread and disbelief. The first bike appeared like a mirage in denim and chrome. Then another, and another, a dozen in all, maybe more. Each one gleaming with that wild, unapologetic energy of rebellion. At their head was Rhett Lawson, helmet under one arm. Jacket patched and faded, steel gray eyes locked on hers. She didn't move, not at first. Neither did Grandma Ruth, who emerged from the porch, knitting in hand, gaze sharp and skeptical. "What in the—" she murmured. Rhett walked forward, slow, but steady, like a man who knew exactly where he was going now. He stopped just short of the steps, pulled something from his jacket, and held it out. A flyer. Her flyer. "You dropped this," he said. Jasmine stared. She hadn't expected to see him again. Not ever. And definitely not like this, with a small army behind him and a look in his eyes that was part gratitude, part gravity. "I didn't think you," she began. "I didn't think you'd come back." Rhett shrugged. "You left fast." Flyer caught the wind. He glanced past her, toward the shelter. "You run this place?" "I do," she answered, more confused than cautious. "Name's Rhett Lawson. Friends call me Wrecker." He gave a crooked grin. "Long story." Behind him, the other bikers dismounted. They looked as expected, rough, scarred, road-worn. But they weren't posturing. They weren't here for trouble. They were watching, calm, respectful, curious. Rhett gestured to the truck behind them. The tailgate dropped. Inside were crates, food, clothes, medicine, toys. Everything Harbor Light had needed for months, maybe years. Jasmine's breath caught. She didn't know what to say. "I get it," Rhett said. "We look like trouble. People cross the street when they see us." His voice softened. "But sometimes broken people know exactly how to help broken places." Grandma Ruth squinted. "So you're just here to help?" Out of the blue, Rhett didn't flinch. "Call it karma. Call it paying it forward. Call it whatever helps. You sleep." His eyes returned to Jasmine's. "But I don't forget when someone saves me, especially when they didn't have to." Jasmine reached out and finally took the flyer from his hand. It was bent now, soft at the edges, a relic of a moment that had already grown into something more. She looked at the crates again, then at the bikes, then at Rhett. "Well," she said quietly, "guess Harbor Light just got a little louder." Rhett smiled. "Good. This place deserves to be heard." And for the first time in years, Jasmine didn't feel like she was fighting alone. Ashford Hollow wasn't ready. Not for bikers at the town's edge handing out toys to disabled kids. Not for strangers rebuilding a place they'd spent decades pretending didn't exist. Not for Jasmine Cole standing tall among them like she belonged, because finally she did. Rhett and his crew didn't waste time. They moved like men who'd spent years fixing what others broke. Within hours, the porch railing was steady again. The sagging gutters were gone. The boxes of food filled more than just cabinets. They filled the room with something the shelter hadn't known in a while, hope that didn't expire. Jasmine stood at the center of it all, watching this strange choreography unfold. Men with calloused hands and leather vests treated her space with reverence. They didn't question her authority. They didn't ask for thanks. They simply worked. And that rattled Ashford Hollow more than any motorcycle ever could. The townspeople noticed. Oh, they noticed. First, it was the diner regulars, older men who hadn't changed their order in 20 years, standing at the sidewalk's edge with their brows furrowed in suspicion. Then came the corner store lady, arms folded like a fortress across her chest. Teenagers hovered nearby on rusted bikes, whispering not so quietly, unsure if this was a rescue or a rebellion. But what they saw wasn't what they expected. They didn't see rowdy bikers throwing beer cans or revving engines for intimidation. They saw Rhett fixing a kid's wheelchair. They saw his brothers organizing medical supplies in the dusty storage room. They saw a woman they once dismissed as just that girl with the flyers, giving instructions like a foreman on a mission, and being respected for it. And slowly, the story shifted. Here's the thing about people. They're quick to judge, but they're even quicker to watch a spectacle. And Ashford Hollow had never seen anything like this. Jasmine knew their eyes were on her. The same ones that used to cut into her like knives now squinted, confused. Not hateful, just uncertain. Because this didn't fit the narrative. These men weren't villains. She wasn't a lost cause. And the shelter It was transforming right in front of them. And not just the building, but its reputation. For the first time, they saw it as something more than a rundown shack run by a woman they didn't understand. They saw it as something worth saving. Later that day, as the sun dipped and long shadows stretched across the cracked concrete, Rhett leaned against the porch post beside Jasmine. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was earned. A silence of shared burdens, mutual respect. "They're watching us," Rhett muttered. Jasmine glanced toward the sidewalk. "Like we're a parade," he chuckled. "Let him stare. Maybe they'll learn something." That line stuck with her. Maybe they would, or maybe they wouldn't. But the difference now? She didn't care. Not in the bitter, resigned way, but in the way that happens when you finally realize that change doesn't need a crowd, it just needs consistency. And she had that. She had Rhett. She had his crew. And, slowly, she had something else. Belief. Not just in the shelter. Not just in the mission, but in herself. In a place like Ashford Hollow, change didn't come with speeches or rallies. It came quietly, like ripples across a still, stagnant pond. It began in subtle glances, in the absence of scorn where scorn had always lived. Jasmine Cole felt it. First not in grand gestures, but in moments that almost escaped notice. The clerk at the gas station, yes, the same one who'd berated Rhett just days earlier, nodded at her when she came in to buy milk. Not a smile, not an apology, but a nod. For Ashford Hollow, that was practically a standing ovation. The next week, the mail carrier, who never once delivered a donation letter without sneering at her address, brought 2 envelopes, one with a crisp $20 bill and the other with a note that read, "I heard what you're doing. Keep going." It wasn't a revolution, but it was a beginning. And beginnings, Jasmine had learned, are sacred. At Harbor Lighthome, the days grew longer, not because they dragged, but because there was finally enough activity to fill them. The kids laughed more, not because their problems disappeared, but because they had a porch to play on that didn't collapse when you jumped. They had working toilets. They had meals they didn't have to ration. And they had visitors actual, adults who came to read to them, paint with them, help with homework. Some were locals, some came from nearby cities. All of them came because one stranger on a bike didn't look away. Jasmine watched it all with a cautious heart. Hope, she knew, was a delicate thing. It bloomed easily in sunlight but withered the moment things went dark. Still, she couldn't deny it. Something had changed, and she allowed herself to believe it might stay changed. Rhett had become a fixture, not in the invasive way, but in the steady, grounding way that reminded Jasmine of her grandfather before the war, before the bottle, before he disappeared one night and never came back. Rhett didn't just help fix Harbor Light, he helped fix the way Jasmine saw herself. Not with compliments or grand declarations, but with consistency. He showed up when the plumbing burst, when a kid fell and needed stitches, when she had to confront a zoning board that didn't want those kinds of children in that part of town. Rhett was there. Silent when she needed silence, loud when the system needed pressure. He didn't become her savior, he became her anchor. And that distinction mattered. One evening, after the last volunteer had packed up and the kids were tucked in, Jasmine and Rhett sat on the back steps, The stars blinked through a soft veil of clouds. Jasmine sipped lukewarm tea from a chipped mug. Rhett nursed a root beer. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Jasmine said, almost to herself, "I thought this place would break me." Rhett didn't look at her, but she felt his attention. Then why stay? She exhaled, a sound caught between a sigh and a laugh. Because breaking isn't the worst thing. Not being seen while you break, that's worse. Rhett nodded slowly. I get that. A pause. Then he added, "But now they see you." Jasmine turned to him. Do they? Or do they just see the crew behind me? He smiled faintly. Does it matter? If it gets them to listen? She stared at the gravel below. Maybe not. But I want them to see the kids too. Not just the patch on your jacket or the paint on the porch. I want them to see why this matters. And that's when it hit her. The shift wasn't about changing hearts overnight. It was about creating moments that forced people to stop and rethink. Just one pause. One crack in the armor of assumption. Rhett leaned back, stretching his legs. We've got more work to do, he said. Jasmine raised her mug. You volunteering for overtime? He grinned. You kidding? I just started. If Ashford Hollow had a pulse, it was faint like the last flicker of neon above a closed-down bar, but something was changing. And on a warm Saturday evening, that faint pulse surged. It wasn't a holiday. It wasn't even anyone's birthday. But the town gathered like something important was happening. And in a way, it was. Folding chairs lined the grass outside Harbor Light Home, which now looked nothing like the forgotten place it used to be. The peeling paint was gone, replaced with a soft, sky-colored blue. The porch didn't groan anymore. It stood strong, its new railing gleaming in the amber dusk. Strings of Christmas lights, recycled from a local church, zigzagged across. The lot like a celebration that didn't need a reason. Jasmine Cole stood just inside the doorway, wiping her palms on her jeans. She wasn't used to this. Attention, approval. She'd grown accustomed to endurance, not applause. And yet here, she was waiting to be called up. Outside, Rhett Lawson leaned against one of the porch posts, arms crossed, expression unreadable. His vest, tossed over the railing, bore the familiar Road Saints patch, but tonight it didn't look like a threat. It looked like a badge of quiet honor. His crew was scattered among the townsfolk, chatting, joking, handing out lemonade. Kids who once ducked behind curtains when strangers came now ran freely across the lawn, their laughter cutting through years of silence. And the townspeople? They sat shoulder to shoulder, not entirely comfortable, but no longer recoiling. It was the most fragile form of community, but it was community nonetheless. The mayor, a gray-haired man who once crossed the street to avoid Jasmine, cleared his throat into the microphone. His voice wavered, not with nerves, but with the unfamiliar taste of humility. Tonight, he said, we're gathered to recognize someone who reminded us that this town, this stubborn, hard-shelled town, still has heart. He paused, or at least it can. He turned toward the house. Jasmine Cole, would you come up here? The crowd clapped. It wasn't thunderous. It wasn't perfect. But it was enough to make Jasmine's heart stutter. She stepped forward, not out of confidence, but out of obligation. Because if the town was finally listening, even for one night, she had something to say. The mayor handed her a wooden plaque, simple, etched with her name and the words, For courage, compassion, and the heart of Harbor Light, Jasmine stared at it for a beat, then looked up. The sea of faces before her, some familiar, some not, blurred slightly as emotion rose. She didn't cry, but she let the weight of the moment settle. And then she spoke. "This plaque is nice," she began, voice even. "But it's not about me. It's about the kids who live in that house behind me. Kids this town forgot. Kids who were always there. You just chose not to see them." The crowd stilled. "And it's about the strangers who showed up when locals wouldn't, who wore leather and tattoos and patches, but had more heart than anyone gave them credit for." A few people looked down. She didn't gloat. She didn't shame. She simply told the truth. "Hope," she continued, "isn't a building. It's what happens when people who aren't supposed to care do." She let the words hang. "And Harbor Light isn't just a shelter now. It's a home for every child, no exceptions." The clapping came slowly at first. Then it grew. Not into a roar, but into something that felt real, sincere, like Ashford Hollow, for one rare night, blinked first and saw itself for what it could be. Afterward, Jasmine walked off the stage. Rhett met her at the stairs. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She handed him the plaque. "Hold this before I throw it like a frisbee." He smiled. Speech wasn't bad. "It wasn't for them," she said, nodding toward the crowd. "It was for the ones who are still being ignored." "They're not ignoring you anymore," Rhett replied. Jasmine looked out at the porch lights flickering on, at the kids running barefoot across the lawn, at Grandma Ruth watching from a rocking chair like she'd known this day would come. "No," she agreed. "Not tonight. Change doesn't sweep through a town like Ashford Hollow in grand strokes. It creeps in like morning fog, slow, soft, almost imperceptible at first. The real test isn't in one night's applause or a mayor's speech. It's in what happens afterward, when the folding chairs are packed away, the lights unplugged, and life dares to return to normal." But for the first time in years, normal felt different. The roads were still cracked, the storefronts still half empty. But people paused more. They asked questions instead of jumping to conclusions. And maybe most importantly, they didn't look away from Harbor Light anymore. Jasmine noticed the shift in subtle ways. A man from the hardware store dropped off a box of tools with no note, no receipt. A retired teacher called and offered tutoring on weekends. Even the sheriff, once notorious for his silence when Jasmine was being harassed on the street, showed up with 2 boxes of canned food and a sheepish nod. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Jasmine accepted it with the quiet grace she'd mastered, acknowledgement without surrender, because grace wasn't weakness, it was strategy. A way to let others step forward without shrinking yourself. The kids at Harbor Light were changing too. Not because their conditions vanished, no one waved a magic wand, but because they finally saw what it looked like to be fought for. When a child feels valued, everything changes. Their posture, their laughter, even the way they walk into a room. Jasmine didn't need validation. But watching those kids bloom under attention they had once been starved for, that was her reward. That was her fuel. Rhett Lawson, meanwhile, had unofficially become part of the landscape. No one dared say it, but he'd gone from outsider to staple faster than anyone could explain. He taught 2 of the older boys how to fix bike chains, helped Grandma Ruth build a garden bed out back, installed floodlights so Jasmine wouldn't have to fumble through darkness every night. Some days he disappeared for hours, maybe even a night or two back on the road, back to whatever life he led before Ashford Hollow, but he always came back. And when he did, he brought something. Supplies. New boots for the kids. One time, a brand new fridge with a dent in the side that made it unsellable, but perfectly fine for the shelter. He never explained how he got these things. Jasmine never asked. That was the unspoken agreement between them. She offered faith. He offered action. One afternoon, as they stacked books in the new makeshift library room formerly the broom closet, Rhett paused. "You ever think about leaving?" Jasmine looked up. "Ashford? Yeah, starting over. Somewhere that doesn't try so hard to pretend you don't matter." Jasmine considered it. "All the time. But if I leave, who fights for them?" She gestured toward the hallway where the kids were giggling over a shared iPad. "You're not obligated," Rhett said. "That's the thing about being strong. People expect you to carry everything forever." Jasmine wiped dust from a book spine. "And what happens when I drop it?" Rhett smiled. "That's when people like me are supposed to step in." She looked at him, really looked, and for a moment allowed herself to believe it was okay not to be the only one holding the line. That evening, as they sat under the stars again, Jasmine asked, "What brought you to that gas station that day?" Rhett leaned back, stretched his legs. "My mom, she was dying. I was on my way back from visiting her. Gave my last cash to a kid who needed meds." A pause. "I thought that town would let me fill up and move on. Didn't expect judgment with my unleaded." Jasmine nodded slowly. "And now you're still here," he shrugged. "Thought maybe I could give something that outlasts me." She smiled. "You already have." Because in a town where stories got passed down like heirlooms, Rhett and Jasmine had rewritten the narrative. And though the ink was still drying, the pages had turned. Harbor Light wasn't just a shelter anymore. It was a symbol. A reminder that kindness doesn't ask for credentials, that you can't always predict who your allies will be, that sometimes the roughest hands offer the gentlest rescue. The transformation of Harbor Light Home didn't just change Jasmine Cole's life, it started to shift Ashford Hollow itself. Like a tectonic plate nudged into motion. People didn't just talk about the shelter anymore. They talked about what it represented, about second chances, about prejudices unlearned, about how kindness could arrive on two wheels and a roar of vengeance and stay to paint walls and plant gardens. It became a symbol, an unexpected beacon. And that kind of light has a way of drawing people in. It started with a letter, handwritten, from a woman in a neighboring town. She'd heard about Jasmine's speech, watched a shaky video of it, posted by a teenager on TikTok. "I cried," the letter said, "because I didn't think towns like yours still had people like you." Then came more letters, more messages, more knocks at the door. A teacher from 5 towns overasked if she could bring her students on a service trip. A young pastor dropped off a van load of art supplies and said, "Your place reminds people of the church they stopped believing in." A small local TV station came out to do a story, and instead of framing it as a charity case, they called it a story of grit and grace. Jasmine didn't seek any of it. She didn't plan for virality. She didn't want fame. All she ever wanted was a roof that didn't leak and enough food to get through the month. But what she was getting was something deeper: community. Not the kind that came with fanfare. The kind that showed up in muddy boots and rolled up sleeves. And that was worth more than gold. Rhett, ever the reluctant hero, watched the growth with wary eyes. "People forget fast," he warned her one afternoon as they loaded canned goods into the new pantry. "They cheer for you one day and ghost you the next." Jasmine nodded. "I know. That's why we don't build for the cheers." She paused. "We build for the ones who show up anyway." He didn't argue. He just smiled and handed her another box. There were still bad days. There always would be. The town council dragged their feet on zoning permits. One neighbor called CPS anonymously just to stir trouble. A local columnist wrote a hit piece suggesting Jasmine was using sympathy for social leverage. It stung. Of course it did. But it didn't stop her. Because after everything she'd endured, after years of walking past closed doors, blank stares, and whispered slurs, Jasmine had grown immune to the poison of petty people. She didn't seek to fight them. She outlasted them. One Sunday morning, while painting a mural on the back wall of the shelter with some of the kids, a little girl named Mia tugged on Jasmine's shirt. "Why are they drawing angels on the wall?" Jasmine glanced at the outline leather jackets, wings made of chrome, halos crooked with mischief. She laughed. "Because angels don't always wear white robes, honey. Sometimes they ride motorcycles." Mia tilted her head. "Like Mr. Rhett?" Jasmine smiled. "Exactly like Mr. Rhett." That image stuck with her. Angels that don't fit the mold. Kindness that doesn't ask permission. Help that doesn't care about optics. The mural became a favorite spot for the kids. They'd sit under it, play games, tell stories. And eventually, the townspeople did too. One old man, someone who once told Jasmine she was wasting her breath, came by and left. A handmade wooden bench beneath the painting. No note, no fanfare. Just the gift of stillness in a place that used to run on chaos, even the local. Schools got involved. They sent leftover supplies, old books, broken computers that Rhett somehow Frankensteined back to life. A music teacher began coming on Thursdays to play guitar with the kids. "I used to think this place was cursed," he admitted one evening. "But maybe it was just waiting for someone like you." Jasmine shook her head. "It wasn't waiting for me. It was waiting for us, all of us." And that's what Harbor Light became. Not a rescue center, but a mirror. One that forced Ashford Hollow to see who they'd been and who they still had a chance to become. Jasmine didn't need them to love her. She didn't even need them to like her. But if they could look in that mirror and see a better version of themselves, she'd done her job. Every movement, no matter how pure, eventually meets its test. Not the test of growth, not even of adversity, but of permanence. Of what remains when the spotlight dims and the noise dies down. That's what Jasmine Cole found herself confronting. As summer faded into fall, the excitement had slowed. The volunteers became fewer. The donations trickled instead of flooded. People weren't abandoning Harbor Light, they were just moving on. Their lives resumed. Their emergencies returned. And Jasmine, once again, was left with her original question: who will stay? It's a hard question, a sobering one. Because the truth is, most people show up when it's convenient. But Jasmine didn't need convenience, she needed constancy. And constancy, she realized, isn't loud. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't trend. It shows up at 6 a.m. with a paint-stained hoodie and an old coffee thermos. It stays late after the last child has gone to sleep. It keeps calling the zoning board even after 5 unanswered emails. Constancy is Rhett cleaning out the gutters in the cold October rain because Jasmine mentioned a leak. Constancy is Grandma Ruth still cutting coupons at the kitchen table to stretch food money. Constancy is Jasmine herself, exhausted, overwhelmed, but never absent. One morning, Jasmine opened the front door and found a package. No note, just a box labeled for the future. Inside was a brand new laptop and a check for $5,000. She stood on the porch for a full minute, the breeze tugging at her sweatshirt, her breath catching like a prayer caught mid-sentence. Rhett appeared. Behind her. Anonymous? She nodded. Yeah. Doesn't matter, he said, stepping outside. What matters is that it came. That was Rhett's magic, not romantic gestures or big speeches, but the way he made the world feel just a bit more manageable by grounding it in the immediate. In action, Jasmine didn't need a white knight. She needed someone who didn't blink when the hard stuff showed up. And Rhett had proven, again and again, he was that someone. But even with all the progress, even with the renewed faith in people, Jasmine knew better than to rest. She had seen how fast things could collapse. She'd grown up watching buildings, literal and metaphorical, crumble from neglect. So she kept pushing. She applied for grants, contacted nonprofits, started organizing monthly town forums. Not because she wanted to lead, but because no one else would. And slowly, Ashford Hollow adapted. The forums weren't well attended at first, but a few people showed up, then a few more. Then a reporter came, and suddenly Jasmine was being asked to consult on how other towns could revitalize their communities. It felt surreal. The woman once ignored at the diner now had a seat at tables she never dreamed of approaching. But Jasmine never changed her tone. She spoke the same way she always had, direct, compassionate, unpolished. And people listened. Because of it. One night, after a long day of repairs, Rhett and Jasmine sat on the porch steps, sharing a quiet meal. A chicken salad sandwich split in two, no candles, no ceremony. Just comfort. Jasmine looked out across the yard, now clean, organized, full of laughter echoing from the kids' bedrooms inside. "You think it'll last?" she asked. Rhett looked at her sideways. What? This? The way things are now? He didn't answer immediately, just chewed, wiped his hands, leaned back. "Depends," he said. "On what?" "On whether the people you helped learn to help someone else. That's how movements stick. Not when they cheer you, but when they repeat you." Jasmine considered that. She hadn't thought of it that way. She always saw herself as holding the line. But maybe the real legacy was how many people picked it up behind her, and that was the quiet victory. Not the applause, not the plaques, but the ripple effect. That somewhere, someone might see what she did and think, maybe I can do that too. Not perfectly, not famously, but earnestly. Jasmine smiled. "You always get philosophical with a sandwich." "In your hand?" Rhett grinned. "Only when it's a good sandwich." Ashford Hollow had been known for its stillness, an eerie, bitter quiet that came not from peace, but from neglect. But these days, that stillness had a pulse. On Saturdays, laughter spilled from the shelter windows. On Wednesdays, cars pulled up with deliveries from people Jasmine had never met. And on any given evening, you could find Rhett Lawson at the back of the building hammering together another set of shelves, while Jasmine quietly updated a spreadsheet that held more dreams than data. But beneath that movement, something even deeper was shifting, something Jasmine hadn't expected. Her own heart, not in the sweeping romantic way fairy tales promise. No, Jasmine had no illusions about love as rescue. She didn't need saving. But she was beginning to understand something she'd never been taught. Growing up, being understood is its own kind of healing. And in Rhett's quiet presence, in his steady hands and steady silences, she was starting to feel like her own walls didn't need to be as high. He never asked her to be less, never suggested she slow down. He just made room for her ambition, her exhaustion, her fire. And in a world that always demanded Jasmine shrink to fit into it, this was radical. One night, after the kids had gone to bed and the shelter lights glowed like fireflies in the distance, Jasmine and Rhett drove out, past the edge of town. No destination, just a stretch of road with no judgment and stars that didn't seem interested in history. They pulled over on a hilltop where the town blinked dimly in the distance and sat on the hood of Rhett's truck. It wasn't a date. It wasn't labeled. But it was real. You know, Rhett said, tossing a pebble down the slope. When I first rode into town, I thought, this is the kind of place that eats people alive. Jasmine smiled. You weren't wrong, he nodded. Yeah, but then I met you. And I realized it's not the town, it's what people let the town turn them into. Jasmine wrapped her arms around her knees. You ever think we're all just walking scars? Rhett turned toward her. Maybe, but scars mean you healed. That you came through. And that was it. That was the thing neither of them had been able to say aloud until now. They were both survivors, not just of circumstances, but of assumptions, of being judged, underestimated, left out. Rhett had grown up in a world that taught him anger was the only armor he could afford. Jasmine had grown up in one that told. Her kindness made her weak. They had unlearned those lies together, slowly, quietly, with grit and grace. Back at the shelter, Grandma Ruth was holding court at the kitchen table with two teenage girls. She wasn't lecturing. She was listening, letting them vent about teachers, boys, their fear of what came next. And that, Jasmine realized later, was the full circle moment. Because when the forgotten begin to see one another, not just as survivors, but as builders, that's when something powerful begins. A community isn't a place, it's a choice. And for the first time, Ashford Hollow had begun to choose Jasmine. And Rhett returned just after midnight. The kids were asleep. The porch light was on, and the mural, those biker angels with chrome wings, gleamed in the moonlight. Jasmine reached for the door, then stopped. You staying? She asked without looking at him. Rhett didn't answer right away. Then, only if you want me to. She turned to face him. I want you to stay when it's hard, when it's boring, when no one's watching. He nodded. Then I'm staying. And just like that, not with a kiss, not with a declaration, but with a promise spoken through presence, they crossed into something deeper. It wasn't love at first sight. It was love born of mutual labor, born of carrying the same burdens. Without ever asking for credit, Jasmine had never believed in fairy tales, but she was starting to believe in something better, earned joy, built peace, grown trust, the kind of love that doesn't arrive, it endures. Every act of good eventually becomes a story. That's how Jasmine Cole began to see her life not as a series of daily battles, but as a slow brewing legacy. And legacies aren't about being remembered. They're about leaving behind something that can be picked up by the next hand. That's what Harbor Light had become, a relay baton. Something she'd built with calloused palms and sleepless nights, and something she hoped others would one day carry forward. The shelter was finally stable. Not perfect, but no longer in crisis. The roof didn't leak. The pantry didn't echo. There were systems in place. Volunteers came weekly, some even on schedules. A retired nurse had set up monthly health checkups. A young social worker offered group therapy for the older kids. Jasmine even had a backup plan for emergencies, 3 trusted names, including Rhett, who could handle things when she needed to rest. It wasn't just functioning. It was thriving, and yet Jasmine couldn't shake a quiet restlessness. Not from discontent, from wonder. What now? When the fire that kept you alive becomes a warm hearth instead of a raging blaze, what do you do next? For so long, her purpose had been urgent, desperate. Now that the emergency had passed, she wasn't sure how to just live. She talked to Grandma Ruth about it one afternoon as they shelled peas on the porch. The sun filtered through the trellis overhead, casting soft shadows on their hands. "I feel guilty," Jasmine confessed. "Like I don't know how to just breathe without feeling like I'm falling behind." Ruth chuckled, her fingers never pausing. "That's how you know you're not done. You've built a home, child. Now build a future." Jasmine frowned. "For who?" Ruth looked at her, eyes sharper than age should allow. "For the girl you used to be, and the ones growing up right now who still think they have to fight alone." That hit deep. Jasmine went for a walk after that. Ended up by the mural. The chrome-winged biker angels still gleamed, though the paint had begun to fade slightly in the sun. She touched one of the wings gently. This wasn't just a tribute. It was a map. A reminder of where she came from and a suggestion of where she might go next. Later that week, Rhett returned from a ride. He'd been gone 2 nights, out to help a friend in another town whose community center had been shut down. He came back not just with stories, but with questions. What if we could help more than this one town? He asked as they stood in the tool shed, sorting donated gear. What if Harbor Light was a blueprint? Jasmine stared at him, eyebrows raised. Like a franchise? He laughed. No, not a chain, a ripple. What if we found other places like this forgotten, underfunded, a void, and helped them rebuild? At first, it sounded too big, too abstract. But then Jasmine remembered the girl she used to be, wandering the streets of Ashford Hollow, ignored, dismissed, alone. What if someone had shown up then? What if they hadn't just dropped off a check, but stayed, listened, believed in her? Her heart skipped. Maybe this wasn't the end of her purpose. Maybe it was the expansion of it. She didn't decide overnight. She thought it through, wrote plans, made calls, consulted Ruth, talked with Rhett under the stars. But eventually, Jasmine began preparing Harbor Light, not just to survive without her at the center, but to thrive with others in leadership. She promoted a young volunteer, Marcus, into a paid coordinator role, created committees, decentralized control. She wasn't walking away. She was walking ahead. And as she packed a duffel bag for her first visit to a town 2 hours west, where a women's shelter had been defunded, she looked around at the porch, the kids waving from the window, Grandma Ruth sipping tea, and Rhett tightening the screws on a new bench. This wasn't goodbye. This was legacy in motion. The highway stretched before them like a thread pulled through the fabric of forgotten towns. Every few miles, Jasmine Cole saw echoes of Ashford Hollow boarded-up schools, rusting fences, people walking with their heads lowered like they were, trying not to remember they once believed in something. She didn't look away. She saw them, really saw them, because she had once been them, and maybe, in a way, she still was. Jasmine didn't drive with arrogance. She didn't ride into town like a savior. She arrived with questions, with open hands, with a roadmap etched in experience, not ego. That first trip west, to a crumbling town called Halstead Glen, was the real test. The women's shelter there, called Riverhaven, had lost funding months ago. It was down to 3 part-time staff, 0 food, and walls so moldy they looked bruised. Jasmine met the director, a woman named Claire, who reminded her so much of herself it was almost uncomfortable. Same sharp eyes, same guarded smile, same exhausted defiance. Claire didn't ask Jasmine how she got there. She asked, "Why are you here?" Jasmine's answer was simple, because someone should have come for me when I needed help, and I won't let that mistake happen again. Over the next few days, Jasmine helped repair a broken boiler with Rhett. She sat in on emergency planning, meetings. She made introductions between Claire and the grant officer who'd finally approved Harbor Lights renovations last year. It wasn't flashy work, but it was foundational. And by the end of the week, Claire wasn't just standing taller, she was dreaming again. She asked Jasmine if it was possible to paint a mural on the back wall. Of what? Jasmine had asked. Claire thought about it, then whispered, "Hands, reaching, not grabbing, just reaching." That's what Jasmine realized this work was, not lifting people out, not solving every problem, but reaching, giving people a foothold, a flashlight, a presence that didn't disappear after a photo op. By the end of the month, Jasmine and Rhett had visited 3 more shelters. Sometimes they brought supplies. Sometimes they just listened. Sometimes they offered blueprints for what had worked at Harbor Light, and just as often, they learned what wouldn't. Back home, Marcus had stepped into his role beautifully. Harbor Light was thriving, not because Jasmine micromanaged it from afar, but because she'd built it to grow without her shadow hanging over every decision. That was the test of leadership. Not how loud you shouted, but how clearly others could carry the tune when you stepped away. Grandma Ruth proudly hosted weekly dinners for the staff and kids. The mural now included new wings, each one painted by a child who had found something here, not just shelter, but voice. Rhett was still Jasmine's anchor, but their bond had evolved. It wasn't about codependence, it was about alignment. He didn't try to slow her down. She didn't try to fix him. They moved together like weathered gears, independent but interlocked. Sometimes they fought passionately, not about petty things, but about direction, risk, who to trust next. But they always return to the same truth. We're better at this together. One night, back at Harbor Light after a long stretch on the road, Jasmine stood in front of the mural alone. It had changed again. A new detail caught her eye. A child had drawn a tiny figure between the angel wings, holding a sign that simply read, "Thank you." Her throat tightened, not from pride, from humility, from knowing that despite the mistakes, despite the exhaustion, despite the nights she still questioned her own worth, she had kept showing up. And sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. Not the loudest voice, just the one that refuses to go quiet. Jasmine turned toward the door, the sound of laughter spilling through the cracked window panes. Tomorrow she'd leave again. Another town, another story. But tonight she was home. And it wasn't just a place. It was a legacy built from the broken pieces of a life that once felt small and remade into something wide enough to shelter others. There are stories that remind us who we are. Then there are stories that dare us to become something better. Jasmine Cole's journey wasn't just about saving a shelter. It was about rewriting the rules of what compassion looks like. It showed use that being seen matters, that being believed in changes everything, and that real kindness doesn't come dressed for a parade. It shows up in old boots, in sleepless nights, in the quiet courage to act when no one else does. In a world that tells us to mind our business, to stay in our lanes, to let broken systems keep breaking people, this story asks, what if you didn't? What if, like Jasmine, you saw the humanity beneath the judgment? What if, like Rhett, you refused to let your past be the final sentence? What if we all stopped waiting for someone else to do the right thing and became that someone instead? Because Harbor Light wasn't saved by a hero. It was rebuilt by community. One small act of courage. One voice that didn't flinch. One stranger who refused to look away. And if that kind of change can happen in a town like Ashford Hollow, maybe it can happen anywhere. You don't need to have all the answers. You just have to care enough to start asking better questions. So what will you build with your hands, your heart, your voice when the world is watching quietly, waiting to see what you'll do?